Hi, I'm your instructor, Andrew Joseph Keith, and this is the Proko Figure Sculpting Fundamentals course. In this lesson, I'm going to go over the top 10 mistakes that beginners make when sculpting and how to avoid them. Being aware of these common mistakes will help us recognize when we start to fall into a bad habit so that we can snap out of it. When a beginner's mistake turns into an ingrained bad habit, it becomes much more difficult and takes a lot more effort to change. This isn't a list of all the possible mistakes that you can make, but it's a good start. Okay, let's dive in. Here's a mistake that we make before we even begin sculpting. Mistake number 1, not choosing an interesting pose. If the pose doesn't have the right feeling or movement, choose another pose. Think about the gesture, the movement, the mood, and what you want the sculpture to communicate. If you start with a boring or stiff pose, you will end up with a weak sculpture. Even if the details of the sculpture are #on point, the sculpture will feel stale. Many times this happens because the pose is too symmetrical. It is very rare to see someone in a symmetrical pose. It's something we almost never do naturally. So when we do see it, it feels fake, like a stiff doll. If that's what you're going for, that's fine, but most of the time I try to avoid a stiff, symmetrical pose. When you do think of a pose, you may not be able to find references for that exact pose. And that's why we had the previous lesson on how to take your own references for sculpture. When choosing a pose, try focusing on the silhouette of the pose and see if it makes a good, readable silhouette from at least a few angles. This brings us to mistake number 2, not having enough references. If you're sculpting directly from a live model, you should be looking at the model as much as you're looking at your sculpture. That's the best way to take full advantage of the experience. It's not always possible to have a live model though, so sometimes we'll have to settle for photo references. Having and using good references is an important part of any type of representational sculpture, whether it's people, animals, plants, cars, or even mythical creatures. For example, if you're creating a mythical creature, you want to find references that have similar characteristics as the creature that you want to create. When I sculpted a dragon, I made sure to get references of the dragon I had in mind, as well as horned toads for the spikes on the skin and alligators for the skin texture and teeth. I find it helpful that if you're sculpting a human figure from photo references, you should have at least 24 different angles of the same pose. This is why we've teamed up with posespace.com to provide some of the references for this course. When we have more experience sculpting and a better understanding of the human figure, we're more free to change things up and deviate from our references. But this comes later, after we've developed the ability to observe and recreate what we see. So as you're starting out, have a lot of references and use them constantly throughout the process. Okay, now that we have an interesting pose and lots of references, on to the next mistake. Mistake number 3, sculpting from one angle. This is an understandable mistake. Most of us, when we start sculpting, we already have experience drawing the figure from one angle. Most of the principles of drawing can and should be applied to sculpture, but a sculpture is not a drawing. The figure must be addressed from every angle. Some ancient sculptures were sculpted to be viewed from a single angle. They were sculpted and meant to be set up against the wall so the viewer could only look at them from the front view. These sculptures would often look amazing from one view, but as you start to walk around the sculpture, things start to look off. Disco Bolas is a good example. Great from the front view, but the sides and back are awkward. Beep. To avoid this, be sure that you're constantly moving around the sculpture and looking at it from every possible angle as you sculpt. Don't fall so in love with one angle that all the other angles suffer for it. Moving around includes stepping back away from the sculpture regularly to view the sculpture back from a distance. When we step back, we can often see mistakes that we missed when sculpting up close. It's a good idea to step back every few minutes to avoid the tunnel vision that comes from sculpting up close. Another way to keep ourselves from falling into this mistake is by focusing on the silhouette of the figure instead of the internal information of the forms. As we focus on the silhouette, we will be forced to move around the figure, capturing the outline from one angle, then moving to another angle and capturing the new outline from that new angle. Mistake number 4, sculpting with inaccurate depth measurements. If you're sculpting from one angle, you're probably making this mistake as well. For example, if we're sculpting the face from the front view, it becomes very difficult to accurately judge the depth of the features. This is probably part of the reason why beginners tend to sculpt the face very flat. Like with the last mistake, moving around constantly and focusing on the silhouette will help us solve this problem. One more thing that can help with this is thinking about the primary forms as boxes, cylinders, and spheres. The lesson on mannequinization will dive more deeply into this concept and how it can help us capture the complex forms more accurately. If we have these 3D primary forms in mind, we are less likely to sculpt flat or do the opposite and have features that are too deep. Pay attention to what your natural tendencies are so that you can work to counteract them. Most beginners tend to sculpt too shallow, but some may sculpt too deep. Most people, when they're just beginning, make the hands and the legs too small when compared to the rest of the figure, but you may have the opposite problem. If you keep in mind the mistakes that you tend to make, then you'll be able to notice them and correct them faster. Which brings us to mistake number 5, not starting out with the correct proportions. This is why I recommend beginning with an armature, even if you're sculpting a sitting or lying down pose where you don't need the armature for support. If you haven't seen it already, be sure to check out the video on making an anatomically correct wire armature for sculpture. Take time to double check your measurements often. When we have an armature that has all the correct proportions, it makes our job a lot easier. It's a huge pain to have to adjust the armature later in the process, so do your best to get it right from the beginning. For beginners, the hands, head, and legs are usually the most difficult to get right in proportion to the rest of the body. So check and recheck these areas. Measuring should be done throughout the process to avoid unproportionate features that will make your sculpture look amateur. If something looks off, it probably is. Mistake number 6, an unbalanced sculpture. Once we have the gesture and proportion of the pose, be sure to check it from all angles to make sure that it's balanced. This should be done at the beginning with the armature, but be sure to recheck the balance once you've built up some mass on the sculpture. With more mass in place, we have a better sense of how the sculpture is leaning and if we need to make adjustments. If the sculpture was standing on its own, would it be able to balance? This can be hard to see sometimes, especially if you're not looking for it. So consciously step back and analyze the sculpture from every angle. A plumb line can come in handy to check the center of mass and see where it falls in relationship to the feet. Mistake number 7, making the sculpture too stiff. This usually comes from not focusing enough on the gesture from the beginning. Remember that as we start to develop the forms, everything tends to want to move towards the center line. We want to establish and maintain the gesture of the entire body, as well as the gesture of the extremities. Remember, if you follow the steps of using the wire armature to capture gesture, you'll usually want to push the gesture just a little bit farther than reality. If we don't do this, the sculpture might lose its energy and movement. As you begin to add clay, start to think about the masses of the body. Don't lose the gesture that you've captured with the armature. Gesture comes before details. Which brings us to mistake number 8, focusing on the details too early. I know this is hard to resist. Sometimes the details, they're just more fun to work on. It's easy to fall into this trap and not finish the previous steps so that we can jump right into the details. But before we start with the details, let's make sure that everything is where it needs to be. Do you remember the drawing lesson on shading where Stan talks about how we should not let the details overpower the primary forms? The same is true in sculpture. We need to develop the primary forms first. Make sure that the masses of the head, torso, and pelvis are correct. Measure everything again. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's a pun. Start with the primary forms, move on to the secondary forms, and then the tertiary forms, also called the surface details. If you do this correctly, you won't have to keep redoing so many parts of the sculpture. Finish each stage and then move on to the next. Mistake number 9, incorrect anatomy. This is obviously a common problem because the fact is that anatomy is really complicated. With this mistake, there's no easy fix. It just comes with time, practice, knowledge of anatomy, and really studying the model. If you haven't already purchased the Premium Anatomy for Artists course, you're missing out. It will definitely help inform your figure sculptures. The less you understand about anatomy, the more important it becomes to really observe your model and try to recreate exactly what you're seeing. Losing the subtlety of anatomy is also a common problem. The muscles usually don't have big crevices or deep gouges in between them. The anatomy of the body tends to be more subtle than beginners make it out to be. Most anatomy can be categorized as secondary forms. These will be built on the primary forms, so be sure that the primary forms are established first. Losing the asymmetry is another thing that I'll mention in regards to anatomy. Realize that each muscle tends to be asymmetrical from side to side, and the shape of the muscles will vary dramatically depending on whether it's flexed or relaxed, or if it's extended versus contracted. Look for asymmetry. The tricep is a good example. Mistake number 10, avoiding the hard areas. Again, this is another understandable mistake. It's the painter that always paints people's hands in their pockets or behind their backs. The irony is, of course, that because they hide the hands, they improve on everything except for the hands. Then their hands look even worse in comparison. It's a vicious cycle. You know, it drives me nuts. It really chafes my tenders. Oh, I'm bad at drawing or sculpting this or that, so I don't do it. Here's something that I was told by a mentor, and I think it's something that everybody needs to hear. You can do difficult things. Repeat that to yourself anytime you need the strength to take on a challenge. I can do difficult things. Those that shy away from working on the areas that they struggle with doom themselves to a lifetime of struggling in those same areas. The most difficult areas of the body are usually the head, the hands, and the feet. These areas can also be the most expressive and interesting parts of the body, so don't lose out on your opportunity to practice them. In fact, try to find what you struggle with and force yourself to work on it. You'd be surprised just how fast you can improve in all areas if you'll start with the most important and difficult things first. Which brings us to our next and probably the most important mistake, which we will go over in the premium course. If you want to know the other 5 mistakes and how to avoid them, you'll have to be a premium member. Can you think of some other common sculpting mistakes that you or others struggle with? I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. The premium course honestly has more information on figurative sculpting than I learned getting my BFA in sculpture. There are premium lessons, longer demos, 3D models, and more, so check it out at proko.com/sculpture. You can share your work on social media using the hashtag #ProkoSculpture, and you can find me on Instagram at Andrew Joseph Keith. I hope to see you in the premium course. See you in the next lesson.